I once knew a man who'd been a pilot in Alaska. We'll call him Scott. Scott had flown helicopters in the military to evacuate soldiers and their families out of dangerous situations in remote locations. Flying had been his life, and Scott's joy in telling the stories of these glory days couldn't help but make me smile, even as I sat next to him in the intensive care unit, with wires connected to his chest and an IV dripping into his arm. Yet another seizure had put him in the hospital. But Scott seemed to be used to it. His face was scratched and bruised from where it had hit the pavement when he fell. And of course, someone had robbed him of his wallet and cell phone as he lay shaking on the ground. He seemed to accept this frequent occurrence with placid resignation. After all, Scott was homeless, and so another stint in the hospital meant that he'd at least get 3 square meals a day, sleep in a clean bed, and not have to fend off aggressive companions at the shelter or on the street. It was astonishing to see how cheerful he remained through it all, as he told one story after another. For a pilot to be grounded in the very literal way that Scott so often was, however, must have been heartbreaking. As his friend, it was also heartbreaking to know that when he got out of the hospital, he would return to the streets and to the alcohol that likely helped put him there in the first place. The cycle continued with no end in sight. Well, none, I fear, but the most final of endings. A life like Scott's would be enough to break the spirit of many people. In the midst of the epilepsy, the homelessness, and the alcoholism, it would be natural for anyone to ask, as the psalmist does, my God, why have you forsaken me and are so far from my cry and from the words of my distress?" And yet, Scott didn't. I admired the heck out of him for that. How many of us could do the same? And that is essentially the premise of our first reading from the book of Job. A wager between God and Satan that enough adversity would break Job's faith and cause him to curse God. The book of Job is a really difficult book to read. I see some nods and smiles here. First, because this righteous man is so often treated like an insignificant pawn in a larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. And second, because of all the internal contradictions that have made both great theologians and simple folk scratch their heads trying to figure out what the takeaway message is. Well, we'll save that question for another day. For now, it's enough for us to empathize with Job's frustration in trying to understand why these terrible things keep happening to him, and his desire to plead his case before the God whom he seeks but cannot find. Where is God in the midst of Job's suffering? Well, this is a case of be careful what you wish for, since Job is terrified by the very thought of standing in God's presence. The righteous man crawls under a proverbial rock, calling upon thick darkness to cover his face. Of course, no darkness will be dark enough to shield the human soul from God's gaze. Before God, no creature is hidden, and all are naked and laid bare to the eyes of the one to whom we must render an account. But unlike Job's terrifying visions of God's judgment, Hebrews comforts us with the image of Jesus Christ, the high priest, who sympathizes with our human weakness because he experienced the same pain, suffering, and struggles as we have. So God, in this case, is compassionate, looking upon us with empathy, which means that we don't have to face God's judgment with terror, but comforted with the knowledge that Jesus wants to give us mercy and grace in our time of need. Hebrews tells us to approach the throne of grace with boldness, not quaking in our boots. God's gaze is not stern and pitiless, even when God is evaluating the health of our souls. In our gospel reading from Mark, Jesus does not condemn the man on the road for his protestations of righteousness. The Bible tells us that Jesus, looking at him, loved him. Jesus did not look on the man with disgust. Jesus did not turn away his face out of disappointment. Jesus did not disown the man for his unworthiness. He simply looked at him and loved him and told him to sell all he had so that he could give the money to the poor. Jesus knows that what he asks of us is difficult, really difficult. And when we can't muster enough virtue or enough discipline to do what he asks, our Lord does not cast us aside, but just loves us. Just loves us. That's it. And keeps on trying to encourage us to follow his example, as painful as that is for us. And that's the main message of these readings from my perspective. God is with us in our suffering, a companion along the way. Whether we're suffering from seizures or drug addiction or grief over the loss of a loved one, God is not absent and unfeeling. God cares. But God cannot do the work that we must do to heal, to grow, to survive. That work, regrettably, is ours alone. God is above all a God of compassion. And the word compassion means to suffer with, alongside. It may feel like God is absent because God isn't taking away the suffering, or because God isn't fixing the problem. That may not be how God works. But what God promises us is, as Jesus said, I will be with you to the end of the age. What we have to do is to attune our senses to perceive God's presence, to hear his whisperings in our ear, to feel God's encouragement in our hearts, to take comfort in God's compassion. And God does not expect us to suffer alone. God is constantly calling us into relationship with each other so that we don't have to suffer alone. Life is too difficult, people, to manage life's struggles on our own, which is why community is so essential. For it is in community, in the love and care we give each other, that God is most palpably present to us. So look for God's presence where it already is, in the faces of each other. Amen.